And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, released a new World Economic Outlook report this week. It warns that the global economy is experiencing, quote, a synchronized slowdown. The lender has lowered its global growth forecast for 2019 again. It cut forecasts for almost all major economies amid trade tensions. So before we get down to a discussion about these rather abstract concepts and the predictions about the economy, let's take a look at this first.
A stark warning from the IMF. The international lender on Tuesday lowered its global growth forecast for 2019 to 3% in its new World Economic Outlook report, down 0.2 percentage point from its estimate in July. The July WEO report already lowered growth forecasts. This is the slowest expansion pace in a decade since the global financial crisis.
The global economy is in a synchronized slowdown, and we are once again downgrading growth for 2019 to 3%. Its slowest pace since the global financial crisis.
Advanced economies continue to slow down from their long-term potential, with growth downgraded to 1.7% this year, compared to 2.3% in 2018. Growth in emerging markets and developing economies has also been revised down to 3.9% for 2019, compared to 4.5% last year. Over the past year, global growth has fallen sharply. The IMF said China-US trade tensions had put the global economy in a precarious position, and estimated frictions between the world's top two economies will cumulatively drag down global GDP.
Policymakers must undo the trade barriers put in place with durable agreements, rein in geopolitical tensions, and reduce domestic policy uncertainty.
Those trade barriers may start to fall after the U.S. and China last week verbally agreed on a partial deal. Besides trade disputes, geopolitical tensions such as Brexit-related risks, subnational regional disparities such as climate change-related issues, labor market adjustment in advanced economies, and structural reforms in emerging markets and developing economies are also key concerns in the WEO report.
Takeaways from the IMF World Economic Outlook report. Let's turn in our guests, turn to them. Washington, D.C., William Lee, the chief economist of the Milken Institute in Washington as well. Saruhan Hatipalu, I hope I pronounced your name right, who is the CEO of risk consultancy firm BERI. In Brussels, we invited Daniel Groh, the director of the Center for European Policy Studies. Last but not least, in Beijing studio, Zhang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. This is rather an abstract report. However, when we think about the real essence in the report, there are a lot to be talking about. Mr. Lee, as always, go to you about China-U.S. The so-called first phase, preliminary round the U.S. president has been talking about, certainly gives us a little bit degree of confidence to the world economy, or not?
Absolutely, and let's remember also that the IMF forecast was put together about a month ago. So the IMF forecast has lagged a lot of the global developments that have a lot of optimistic twists to it, including Brexit settled today and the U.S.-China trade deal. The thing that we have to remember is that the IMF slowdown is mainly because of the interrelatedness of the supply chains that have hit the manufacturing sector, and that source of the slowdown has dragged down the global economy, and in particular the auto sector has played a tremendous role in this. So it's a sectoral hit, it's a global hit, and it's also a trade supply chain hit.
But, you know, I still want to follow up about the question about China-U.S. We know it is only an incentive, but whether the two will really have a deal, to what degree, does it lessen the impact on the global supply chain negatively? Does it give more predictability of the economy? All unknown, Ms. Lee.
Yes, in fact, it's unknown for now, but the nature of the resolution is yet to be penned. As the announcement said, we still have to paper the deal, and we will see what happens if this deal is signed when the leaders meet in November in the APEC meeting, what the nature of the deal is, and more importantly, what the nature of how credible enforcement mechanisms have been put in place so that the markets be assured that phase 2 will start on time and be productive.
And of course, Mr. Gong, I want to ask you about that, Professor. From the Chinese perspective, how do you see that? More predictability? Not necessarily so yet.
Well, my view is that previously the most important handicap has been the enforcement mechanism. You know, both sides have been arguing about the language that goes into this agreement about the enforcement mechanism. But I think right now this is probably less of an issue because I think the tariff is serving as an enforcement mechanism. I think the U.S. is adopting a phased approach. In other words, you do something here, I'm going to stop imposing tariffs. You do another set of structural issues, I'm probably going to reduce tariffs.
And of course, China would also retaliate against the tariffs being put on China as well.
Right, right. But I don't think the U.S. is going to put more tariffs again, provided that China.
Whether you think or not is not necessarily going to be the key. I guess it's whether the White House so far really think about that.
I think
and how the two sides interact.
I think there's one very key point here is that remember when Vice Premier Liu He was in Washington for the 11th round of negotiation, he laid out 3 conditions, if you still remember them. The second condition is that the United States has to restore or eliminate all these tariffs that have been imposed before the trade war started. We don't have this anymore. So it's clear to me that I think both sides are not so much embroiled in the debate about enforcement mechanism. We're going to take a phased approach. We're going to address some issues along the way. At the same time, my conjecture is the United States is going to reduce these tariffs along the way.
It seems that the U.S. has also learned that the Chinese believe it's an incremental process. It's not about take it all as the winner, but rather it's a negotiation than one coming with the order, the other obey with that. Let me go to also Mr. Guo, because this is a big day, supposed to be at least when it comes to Brexit. But of course, there are a lot of nuances. The apparent partial withdrawal agreement has been reached, but up to the lawmakers to go with it, which of course will be more drama to come. Mr. Guo, what do you think?
Yes, certainly more drama is certainly awaiting us here in Europe. The agreement we have today is actually a full agreement. It's an agreement which the UK could have had 2 years ago, but rejected the EU's approach then. And Boris Johnson has first presented himself as, I am going to leave the EU and nothing can stop me. And now he hopes that nobody will look at the fine print and that his parliament will accept the deal, which is unlikely. And therefore, I would say next week we'll have further fireworks. Yeah.
Coming up Saturday, Friday, different time zones, there's likely to be a lot of interactions, to say the least. Of course, it's the European Union first, and then we'll see how the British Parliament react to that. But to follow up on that as well, Mr. Guo, I want to ask you, how do you think this is, temporary, little spice of confidence would mean for the European economy and that of the UK as well, which certainly is a big economy?
I don't think this Brexit agreement will have a big impact, because everybody knows in this form it will not get through unless there are elections or a second referendum in the UK. And only after all this uncertainty, which still remains, has been eliminated, only then I think we can hope for some boost of confidence. It might only be 1 or 2 months away. Yeah. But as of today, I would say, practically speaking, most of the uncertainty remains.
Patipoglu, Professor, Mr. Patipoglu, you've been listening to your panelists very attentively. So in the IMF report, we want to come back to the very important report, suggesting of slowdown of the economy coming from emerging markets and developing countries as well. So it seems that it's an overall, not necessarily positive development, world economy.
Well, that's absolutely true. The report itself was dire and very bleak.
And the IMF is a little late in the game. They provide these forecasts earlier on. It's always optimistic, and then they start cutting down forecasts. But the writing was on the wall as far as the global economic performance as early as January, with the trade battle, if you will, turning into war, as well as the insistence of some regions and countries, and I would definitely single out the EU here, not engaging in expansionary policies, especially in the fiscal front. The IMF has blatantly stated, the chief economist also stated, that the monetary policy has done everything it can, and we're at a point where lowering interest rates might not help the global economy. And I think that was a big message sent to policymakers before this meeting.
Interestingly, this is not as dry as many people think a conversation, right? I mean, gentlemen, I hope you would agree with me, because there are a lot of nuances going on every day. It's not just about the dry numbers, but rather the real stories behind the numbers. That's what's really important. On that point, I want to go to you once again, Mr. Hadipoglu. The global supply chain is one of the most important factors people are studying, making sure whether they should still have much confidence about the continuity of growth of the world. What do you think is the current stage, and how is it really related to, let's just say, immediate growth next year?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because the situation as far as the corporations are concerned and their supply chain is absolutely frightening. Gary Shapiro of Consumer Technology Association said it very vividly. He said American companies thrive on spending their time and energy on innovation and competing on the global platform rather than checking Twitter on a daily basis. So this is a very important issue as far as businesses are concerned. But I will also tell you from the front line, when I talk to my clients, some of these supply chains have already shifted, have already been modified. And there is some kind of a misconception out there thinking that, oh, if the US-China trade deal or problems get resolved, these companies immediately go back to the supply chain that they have created, spending probably 20, 25 years during globalization. They're immediately going to go back to that. They can't. They already have sunk costs, and we are seeing the economic impact of the spending that they have undertaken on numbers that are coming out in manufacturing. Activity in manufacturing, I got to tell you, it's the lowest in a decade. Services industry, lowest in 3 years. So I think more bad news is on the way as far as supply chains are concerned.
It is really, Mr. Lee, the fundamental issues that we should really study here when it comes to the economy. You've been shaving your hands, so what does that mean? You don't agree, or you have other perspectives? Mr. Lee.
I think I'm very optimistic that supply chains are shifting, and they have to shift because China and the U.S. constitute 60% of the global GDP. The China and U.S. deal is going to reshape the supply chain patterns for the 21st century. And the policy initiative by President Trump is to try to have bilateral deals by which a lot of the supply chains are shifting to the benefit of different countries that are willing to enter into trade pacts. As similarly, China is trying to shift its supply chain so that China will advance the high value-added activities, high value-added manufacturing, and high-wage jobs for China. And that necessarily will shift the supply chain. So it's a great thing that supply chains are changing.
Okay.
The issue is, will it change in a way that benefits growth?
Interestingly, that is the issue here. And benefit growth of whom? Is it going to be more shared by the rest of the world? Professor Gong, go to you about that. Now, what we heard is about Vietnam, right? That's a big name about the global supply chain. But most stories are just about Vietnam. For the other economies, even in Asia, it takes 2 to 5 years at least to get the global supply chain being scattered around, even when China is presenting the opportunity to the region. What does that mean, Professor Gong?
Well, first of all, I would argue that the supply chain decisions, I agree with one of the panelists that says that once these decisions are made, typically they're irreversible. Okay, so but typically, these decisions are not going to be visible very soon, immediately. It takes some time, but we know that it's on the drawing board in the board meetings of these companies, right?
Sure.
But by the time we know this, it's already too late. Okay, so I totally disagree with the statement that this is a very good thing. I mean, from China's perspective, we definitely would like to have these American companies still keep operating here in China. But I agree somewhat that some companies are leaving China probably for the benefit of themselves, because manufacturing tends to have a migration pattern,
That's
right? It's not going to stay here forever.
And China is restructuring its economy. Of course,
we're also
service
restructuring
sector, if you look at that.
So there are some companies moving on, that's okay. But we have to keep in mind that China still remains to be the world's largest consumer market. For many American companies, this is still a very attractive market here. And if you look at the overall business environment, the very comprehensive system of manufacturing capabilities, it's still a very attractive place for manufacturing. So I think that there's this outward foreign direct investment movement, but it's not going to be large scale.
About that question, I also want to go to Mr. Guo about the European situation. You have various economies at very different development stages. Some are already at the very top of the global supply chain. Others are, coming up doing manufacturing. So if you look at the Central and Middle European countries, some of them. So what do you think about these various development stages for the European economies as a whole, global supply chain-wise?
We have actually a very good European supply chain. Whereby car parts, for example, go from one country to the next, back and forth several times. Brexit might put some spanners in the work here for one part, but otherwise the rest of the continent remains one unified market. But I think even in Europe we feel the impact of the tensions between China and the US, and not so much because of the tariffs. The tariffs actually are good for European competitors. But when the US designates Huawei as an entity with whom no company should do business, then of course many European companies and other companies in Asia are also affected. And the problem is one never knows. Today it's go, tomorrow it's no go, the day after who knows. And this uncertainty will remain, even if there's a phase 2 agreement between the US and China, because everybody knows Trump might wake up tomorrow and find something else. And it is this uncertainty about these interventions by the US administration in the supply chain which has such negative effects, I think, for everybody on the planet.
What you have said, Mr. Guo, is a very important element in this discussion, because earlier if we talk about global supply chain, it's only one factor of the global economy, but what you are talking about now is the logic now when we see the growth. It's the unpredictability, and very important word that we all have in mind. So psychologically, it's probably even more important than what are some of the facts on the ground for the future of the economy in immediate term. Mr. Li, go to you. You're an optimistic person by nature, so how about that question?
Absolutely. The most important drag on global growth now is the fact that companies are not willing to invest capital, especially here in the United States and in Europe, because of that uncertainty. But there's always uncertainty. You can't be in business without knowing
I don't necessarily agree with what you just said. Mr. Li, I mean, there's always uncertainty. Yes, indeed, but there's various degrees of uncertainty. 1 year could be very different from the other. Yes, right. There we go. Go ahead, sir.
There's much more uncertainty now than ever before, and it's now the responsibilities of the leaders to set the framework, and that's exactly what's being done. That's the process of negotiation, and unfortunately negotiations always take a lot of time, and that time for negotiation is what causes investors to be uncertain about where to put their money and where to put the new plant and equipment. The thing that the global economy needs now is to set that framework in place and everyone be sure what the new rules are going to be. That eliminating that uncertainty, you'll see a major boom in the global economy.
You know, Mr. Hatipaklu, if you look at that, there are actually a lot of certainties if you look at the fundamentals. Even with the example, China and the United States. Now, the U.S. companies, their market in China is earning them more than the U.S. exports to China already. So one could tell from a business perspective, very clear what the nature of the picture is. However, we're not talking about we're operating the economy in a vacuum, because there is geopolitics coming into being as well. Another important element when we think about the economy now compared to, let's just say, 3 years ago, Mr. Hatipaklu.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. You're absolutely right. And that's why I'm not sharing the optimism that Mr. Lee had, even though I hope we are going in that direction. But we're not. The agreement, which is not even signed yet, by the way, between the two sides, U.S. and China, is a numbers-only agreement. They have put everything aside that they don't want to talk about because it would actually hit this numbers-only agreement. But geopolitical issues have brought to the forefront even more concrete differences between U.S. and China. Sure, American businesses would want to get into China and enjoy that huge market, and there's some structural reforms taking place. Especially, I'm very happy to say that in financial industry, these reforms are taking place. But at the end of the day, geopolitics is going to be driving the trade negotiations. Look, we've heard the expansion of the blacklist for IE startup companies in China. We have heard about not only from the president and the White House, but also Democratic Party, the side that is being changing its tone. It's becoming very harsh on China.
Yeah.
Hong Kong is becoming an issue now. Not only the governments, but corporate leaders are talking about Hong Kong. We have Pentagon creating a list of companies that are doing business with American companies to protect weapons supply chain. So all of these things cannot be, in my opinion, taken away from the comprehensive trade agreement.
Yeah.
Yes, there was a good progress in what we've seen last week here, but to me it was sticking plaster on a gaping wound.
Mr. Grohl, it seems that Mr. Halipoglu very clear about his concept, that is, the logic of business is not the logic anymore when it comes to business. Now, handle that. Mr. Grohl.
That is the problem. We have here a situation whereby we appeal to global leaders to take away the uncertainty. But with Trump, that's impossible because he signs one thing today and tomorrow he has a Twitter going in the different direction. So therefore I agree. We should ask him to do something. I think the cold reality is that this uncertainty about what the US will do towards China will stay with us for the next few years, and business will have to adapt to it. It is adapting already. It is retreating from the global supply chain, and unfortunately there's nothing much we can do about it.
You know, when you think about it, gentlemen, there's one fundamental thing we haven't asked yet. That is, what's going to be the logic of the world? You know, think about it. Whether the international system will remain what it is, even IMF will remain its role or not, even though it's putting out a report every year. And what about global trade organization, WTO negotiations? What about bilateral, multilateral, these frameworks? These have been stabilizing factors, guarantee economy and growth on a larger basis for the world. So what about now? That is one question I really want to ask every one of you. Mr. Lee, take it from here.
That's a great question. I spent most of my career at the IMF as deputy chief of various divisions. I was in charge of U.S., Germany, and Hong Kong representative. One of the things about the failure of the multilateral institutions is that they have failed to realize that the multilateral trade system that was put up post-World War II has failed, and we need to restructure it. And the restructuring is painful right now. You see the negotiations between China and the U.S. really are much more bilateral focused. That's the kind of future that we have to create in a positive way, and China realizes that by creating the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, because the other multilateral institutions were failing to do infrastructure investment. So there's a lot of failures among multilateral institutions, but fortunately China has had the vision to be able to start new institutions that can fill the gaps, and I think that's the future. There'll be more institutions put up by different countries to fill the gaps that the multilateral institutions have failed to do.
I know it, gentlemen, that at the end of our conversation you want to go with the positive energy rather than the negative energy, but let's talk about the positive energy. Whether these mechanisms and initiatives will really work. Professor Gong, I want to handle that for us, particularly some of the new initiatives, new kinds of platforms, new kinds of interactions among emerging developing countries and the other way around with the developed economy. Will they really work, Professor?
Well, there have been numerous developments recently in the area of international governance, in trade and investment, but I think the most important development so far has been this initiative from Washington to essentially create a network, U.S.-centric, Washington-centric, bilateral in nature kind of a set of agreements. The United States has signed agreement with Canada. Well, it's going to, if approved by Congress, with Canada, that's the USMCA. With Mexico, it has already signed a bilateral trade agreement with Japan. I think it's very easy for it to get in another agreement with the UK. Yeah. It has Australia, South Korea in the basket, and I think probably the negotiations with EU is a little bit more difficult. But if you combine all these agreements, that's already 70% of WTO. The United States is creating a WTO 2.0 here.
Interesting.
It's creating a different a framework, essentially, in competition with WTO.
That's your perspective. Let me go to you also. Sorry to cut you short, but we're running out of time. I want to have more voices coming in here. Mr. Guo, of course, will the U.S. action so far of a so-called bilateral approach disrupt the already existing frameworks? And how would countries and economies make their choice? Because on the one hand, they have to come to certain kind of agreement with the United States if it is their biggest market. However, on the other hand, the smaller or middle-sized economies want international platforms to protect their legitimacy for the future, not to be manipulated by one power or the other. Mr. Guo.
Exactly. There are all these small to medium-sized powers which depend on the multilateral system. My prediction actually would be the opposite. I think the US will end up isolated. It might strike some superficial agreements with some other countries, but everybody else will try to safeguard what we have in the WTO, perhaps having a WTO minus US. But I think so far we have not seen really any country wishing to follow the US route, because everybody else knows that if you talk about trade, you talk about growth, and that's what people want to keep.
I see. Last but not least, Mr. Hatipoglu, how do you see that?
Well, I see a shift to bilateralism. I think everybody on the panel agrees with that. But I'd like to rewind and go back 10 years ago when the financial crisis hit. One of the most important issues that came out from that G20 in London in 2009 was a collective statement from world leaders, financial leaders, saying that we will actually take the necessary measures to deal with this problem. That is the kind of message that the world needs to hear in times of crisis. And I think today we are in crisis. In economic terms, we're getting there, but in geopolitical terms, we're definitely in crisis. So bilateralism is good in that certain things need to change. I agree with one of the panelists that said multilateral system needs to be modified. I completely agreed with it, but it should not be replaced.
I see we're running out of time. Thank you so much for the four of you. Yes, indeed, four of you, William Li, Saruhan Hatipoglu, Daniel Guo, and John Gong. Really running out of time. Thank you for the debate.